Does God exist? Are science and faith enemies? Your host for this series was an atheist who became a believer in God through his studies in science. Here is public high school teacher John Clayton.
This particular discussion brings together two things we've talked about in previous videos. We've talked about which God. Why Jesus Christ? Why not Muhammad? Why not Buddha? And we've tried to indicate that there are internal evidences, there's checkability, there's system design that leads us to advocate that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that the God of the Bible is the God that we should be serving, and that the Bible gives us a way to live that is successful and compatible with the wishes of that God. We've also talked about design. We use design to discuss evidence that God, in fact, has created the creation, that the creation is not a product of chance. I call this discussion God's finest design, the church. You see, I think what happens a lot of times is that as I'm presenting programs in public venues, I'll have somebody come up to me and say, well, okay, I can believe there's something out there, and okay, I see that Jesus Christ presents a way of living that brings peace and joy and beauty, has great wisdom, and I can buy the Christian system, but don't talk to me about this church junk. I don't want to hear about church junk. And I understand that. You know, most of our associations with church, especially negative associations, have to do with people. And people do stupid things. And I'm not here to justify anything any human being does. But when you look at what the Bible teaches about the church, I think you see that it is in fact very wise, very functional, very workable, very necessary on a logical basis. Now, some of the things that we've already talked about are a part of this, and there's actually several different areas that I want to discuss in this presentation, but in the interest of time, we're not going to go into depth in some of them. For example, the structure of the church we've really sort of already dealt with in the discussion about which God. We've talked about the fact that unlike Hinduism or Buddhism, where man is expected to reach a certain condition to be pleasing to God, in the biblical system, God is reaching to man. So the passage in Revelation says, behold, I stand at the door and knock, God seeking man. And we see in the Bible statements like this passage in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 5, which indicates that our relationship to God is a very personal relationship, that there's no human between us and God. We are not second-class citizens in the Christian system. It's also interesting to notice, and we've discussed this previously, that the church is a spiritual body, not a physical being. So Jesus said things like, wherever two or three are gathered together in my name, there will I be also. And we already talked about the fact that the Bible says that we are the temple of God. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God? That we don't need monstrous amounts of money to build huge edifices, to build great buildings, that the church can meet in a cornfield, in a submarine, in a basement. And I submit to you that these are things which demonstrate great wisdom, great design. It allows the church to function in political situations where Christianity is being persecuted. It gives the capacity for all people, not just people of money, to be able to worship and serve God in a pleasing way. I would even suggest to you that the concept of heaven that the Bible presents is a beautiful concept. One of my struggles with the Muslim system is what it portrays as the reward that those that are faithful to God have. I'm not really interested in being in a place where I'm served certain kinds of wine and have groups of black-eyed virgins surrounding me. It really is a portrayal of a very sensual physical nature that comes across. The concept of heaven being a situation where we're free of time and where all of the restrictions and problems and difficulties of this life are no longer there is beautiful. It shows design. And I'm not really interested in being reincarnated in this physical existence. Now, we could spend a great deal of time talking about those, but I find people don't struggle with those kinds of concepts once they understand them, as much as they do the worship of God. I think sometimes we have portrayed the worship of God with the idea that somehow God needs our worship. we have failed to understand why worship is important. And so let's take a look at this and let's think logically about why we do these things. Why does God tell us to do these things? For instance, prayer. Now, as you're looking at these passages that tell us to pray, and there are many of them. I mean, we're just giving you 4 of them here, but there are many passages in the Bible that talk about prayer. I'd like for you to ask you to think about something. Why does God tell us to pray? Is it because God's up in heaven saying, boy, I sure hope these people inform me about what's going on down there. I really need information. I sure hope they tell me what's happening. See, if you understand that in Him we live and move and have our being, if you understand the nature of God, which we've already discussed, then surely you realize that God doesn't need us to tell us what's happening. Is it because God has some ego problem? And God's up in heaven saying, boy, I'm really depressed today. I sure hope these people praise me because I'm just down in the pits. God's not a human. God doesn't have these kinds of struggles that we have. He doesn't have a bad hair day. I don't either, frankly. But He doesn't have those kinds of situations that put stresses and problems in His life that cause Him to somehow become very negative about life. That's not God. Well, then why does God tell us to pray? You know, many years ago there was a court case in New Jersey in which there was a debate going on about the role of transcendental meditation in public education. And in the process of all the debate that was carried on, there was some interesting statistical data that was offered. People that have learned how to master TM have shown clearly that they can provide various therapeutic physiological advantages to TM. Their blood pressure goes down, their body temperature drops, they have reduced oxygen consumption, there's good biofeedback in their brain, and so forth and so on. But do you know that active Christians hooked up to the same equipment give the same kind of data? See, Christians pray primarily for their own benefit. When God says to pray, He's not telling us to do something that satisfies some need of His. God tells us to pray because He knows the need we have. Almost all programs that help people dealing with substance abuse or problems like that, one of the first things that is said is, learn to look to a higher power. There is a tremendous need for us as human beings to get beyond ourselves, to be able to look to something greater than us, and to be able to focus in prayer on that being. And I would suggest to you, for Christians who understand God as a personal God, you have an interaction that allows you to grow to love and appreciate and feel close to that God. A man and a woman who never talk are a man and a woman who will never have a relationship of any kind. And our need to talk to God is for our own benefit. You know, another example of that is singing. God tells us to sing. Now, why does He do that? I mean, as you look at these passages, notice the continual emphasis on participation. Is it because God likes good music that He tells us to sing? Now, I'm sure God likes good music, but if He expects good music from a lot of us, He's in trouble. Is it because God has to be entertained? See, once again, we're turning God into a human being. We're trying to attribute characteristics to God that are similar to the kinds of things that you and I have struggles with and have needs for, rather than recognizing the true nature of God. I don't watch much television, but during the Persian Gulf War years ago, my wife was watching this USO show that was being given there on an aircraft carrier or someplace like that. And the guy that was singing was a gentleman by the name of Lee Greenwood. And those of you that know anything about Lee Greenwood know that he has written a song which is called I'm Proud to Be an American. It's a very patriotic song. It's a beautiful song. proud to be an American where at least I know I'm free. And he talks about that if he lost everything, as long as he still had his relationship to this country, that he could rebuild. And it's just full of positive messages and patriotic messages that are encouraging and uplifting to those of us that are Americans. So he started to sing this song near the end of the show with all of these soldiers and sailors and people that were in the Persian Gulf situation around him, and it was a huge audience. And people are sitting there very politely listening, and then he stopped what he was doing and he said, we're all over here in a very uncertain situation. We're a long way from home. He said, I think most of you know this song pretty well. Why don't you join me in singing the song? And so all of a sudden, the presentation turned from entertainment to participation. And it's not often you can get emotions carried through the TV camera, but boy, it happened. I mean, as he starts the song and people are singing with him, you can see people reacting. All of a sudden, I can't believe this was signaled, that the audience came to their feet and they're joining hands. And they're lifting their voices together, talking about America and about their unity and about their common mission. And tears are starting to flow. And by the time he got to the third stanza, there's these grease jockeys from the boiler room with tattoos up and down them standing next to this little petite nurse in a white nursing uniform, and they're both just weeping and the tears are flowing and there's a closeness and a bond. See, I believe that's the kind of thing that happens or should happen with singing. In the Christian system, worship is not a spectator sport. And some of my fondest memories as a Christian are not necessarily worship that happened in church buildings, but perhaps in a camp or a retreat out in the boonies someplace, where under the stars and the beauty of the creation around, those who share common values and feelings could join hands and lift their voices in praise to God and feel the closeness and the unity. People say, I don't need the church, I don't need worship. I don't believe that. There is a need for us to feel that kind of participation and involvement and closeness. I want to make sure we get this one in, so let's jump down to giving for a minute. We have 3 passages here that talk about giving. And once again, I'd like to ask you to think about why God has told us to give. As you read these passages, what's the purpose of this? Does God tell us to give because God's up in heaven saying, boy, I sure hope these people come up with a good contribution this morning or we're going to be in trouble? Is God somehow talking to his accountants and saying, boy, if these people don't come through with a good contribution, we're going to have to file Chapter 11? If we understand anything about what we've been talking about in this series of lectures about God as the Creator, then surely we understand that God has created everything. It all belongs to Him. God doesn't need our money. If every believer in God were to decide as of this minute they are not going to give one more penny to God in any way, God's work would still get done. God doesn't need our money. Well, then why does God tell us to give? I heard a story a couple of years ago that I'm sure many of you have heard, but it fits this so beautifully. I hope you'll tolerate it again if you've heard it. I've never been to Palestine. I've never had that opportunity. But I'm told by people who have been to Palestine that there are 2 bodies of water in Palestine that are very, very different from each other. One of those bodies of water is a place that is just incredibly beautiful. It's called the Sea of Galilee. Jesus went there frequently, and apparently it's a beautiful place. The waters are full of fish. Waterfowl just are all over the place. Migrating birds come by the millions to this area. And animals are abundant in the area surrounding the shores of this beautiful lake. As a matter of fact, today I guess it's developing as a resort area. Lots of people are going there for their vacations. It's just a gorgeous place. But you know an interesting fact about the Sea of Galilee? When they measure the volume of water that goes out of the lake compared to the volume of water that comes into the lake, there is much more that goes out than comes in. Apparently there's underground springs under the lake that feed it. Apparently there's significant rainfall in the lake. So it actually gives more than it gets. And it's beautiful. But just downstream from the Sea of Galilee, there's another body of water. Very different kind of place. It's an ugly place. It's called the Dead Sea. There are no fish in the lake. There are no birds around the shore. Migratory waterfowl will detour around it. So do people. People will drive hundreds of miles out of the way to avoid getting close to it. There are no animals on the shores, only a little brine shrimp activity. The Dead Sea. See, the Dead Sea has no outlet. The river flows into it, but nothing goes out. And it just takes and it takes and it takes and it takes. And it's ugly. And it's dead. And don't you see that's the way people are? The person who has learned to give is a person that's going to be able to be happy in life. And we're not just talking about money here. We're talking about love. We're talking about family. We're talking about sexual relationships. We're talking about the church. God tells us to give not because God has needs, but we have an enormous need to know how to give and to be able to give abundantly. Now, there are many other parts of this worship thing that we could discuss. But I'd also like to suggest to you that there are many other areas of activity. The design of the church, again, radiates incredible wisdom and purpose. We're told in Hebrews 10 and verse 25 not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together. And we have all of these passages which talk about fellowship. And it's interesting as you look through those passages, you see these people coming together, you see the word love used a lot. And the question is, why does God tell us to do this? Why is it so important for us to attend? Why is it so important for us to love one another and to have that kind of fellowship? You know, when I started doing these lectures back in 1968, I had this young, energetic drive to do every program I could possibly do. And so I scheduled programs every single weekend. I would teach school all week, and on Friday I'd take off from home and I'd go do a lectureship and come back late Sunday night and start teaching again on Monday. My wife and I had to work very, very hard at making sure that I spent adequate time with my children and that I spent adequate time with her. But I was on fire that this was something I needed to do. And, you know, I think I handled my family situation fairly well with her help. But you know what was happening? I found that being in a situation where I was presenting and teaching and doing stuff every weekend, that my own spirituality began to slide. I found that I needed to have my batteries charged. I needed to be re-taught certain things. There needed to be an emphasis for me to have someone else tell me and remind me of the important things in my relationship to God. And I found very quickly that I couldn't do a program every weekend. And so now when I schedule programs, I make sure that I have adequate time to go to my local congregation and to be fed. And it may be that the preacher won't say anything I haven't already heard. You know, there's a hymn that says, "Tell me the old, old story, for those who know it best are hungering and thirsting to hear it like the rest." See, we need to have that kind of reinforcement. We need to have that kind of encouragement. And we need to be together. We're commanded to love one another, but how can I love you if I'm not with you? In the first century church, we see that people got together daily And they ate their meals together daily. And it's that constant association and building up that caused people to be able to develop a bond and a relationship that sustained them through the difficulties and the vicissitudes of life. When God tells us not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together, He's telling us something that is not for His benefit, but for our benefit. And we desperately need that. When He tells us that we are to associate with one another, that Christians are to be the mainstays in our life, that there is to be daily association as the people practiced in Acts 2, He's telling us something that will benefit us and will give us the strength to deal with the difficulties in life and with the persecutions and problems that come upon us from the outside. How we are to conduct ourselves, every facet of the church makes sense. And I would like to suggest to you that it is even true that what God tells us we need to do in obedience to Him makes sense. I mean, it should be obvious that when we read these passages that tell us to believe, that there's no mystery here. We need to believe in order for our lives to be able to have all these other advantages we've talked about. But why does God tell us to repent? I mean, as you read these passages that talk about repentance, can't you see how important it is for us to be turning our life away from a life that is destructive and arrogant and conceited and self-centered and turn to a life that is constructive and has direction and has meaning? There's no mystery as to why we need to turn away from a destructive life and turn to God's way of life. Why does He tell us to confess? Why is it important for me to confess Christ in my daily life? How can we influence others if they don't know where we get our strength? How can we form the kinds of relationships that God knows will benefit us if we aren't sharing those things that give us the value systems that we have? There's a tremendous wisdom in us accepting the responsibility to tell the world about our relationship to Christ and to confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So we read things like, "He whoever confesseth me before men, him will I confess before my Father." That simply shows the importance of what we're doing, the importance of our mission here upon earth. And I would even submit to you that baptism is a logical, reasonable thing to do. You know, people that have been raised in the church have perhaps a harder time understanding this than those of us that have lived in the sewer and who have become Christians. For me personally, being able to be buried in the waters of baptism, to put the old John Clayton in the ground and to be able to come forth a new creature, to be able to put the past behind me and make a fresh start, that was the most incredible thing I can imagine. And it didn't depend upon my emotions, although there were heavy emotions involved. It didn't depend upon my feelings. It was a guarantee from God that I could wash away my sins and that I could come forth a new creature, ready to begin a new life. That was so incredible and so beautiful. I do a lot of work in prisons. And I have seen men and women who have had a life just full of sin. And when they're able to be buried in baptism and bury the old self and come forth a new creature, I have seen the radiance and the beauty and the freedom and the tools that are given to start all over. And living the Christian life, which is also a part of our living obedience to God, clearly makes good sense. How can we change the world if we're not living the system? God's finest design, the church. I hope as you've thought about some of these things that we've considered in this discussion, you've realized that the whole perspective of the church is not some human institution that's designed to control and repress and suppress men and women, but it's a method by which God serves us. That God gives us things that strengthen us, that build us up, that encourage us, that give us the capacity to deal with the difficulties and struggles in life. And if you're not part of the church, I would urge you, find your local congregation. Check it out. Do these things that God has told you to do. Not because some human says to do it, but because you recognize that God has given you something that will benefit you, and He's given you that because He loves you and His Son to die for you.
Does God Exist is an educational program which attempts to provide evidence that man can logically believe in God and that the Christian system presented in the New Testament is the best option for successful living. We offer materials free and on loan. Contact us by mail, fax, or email for a catalog, to request materials, or just to ask questions. Does God exist may be the most important question you will ever ask.